The fine arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked inside a bright yellow envelope that was jammed so hard into my mailbox slot that I had to actually tug it free. Outside, the temperature had dropped to about 12 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and there was a solid 6 inches of fresh snow covering every flat surface in the Maplewood Creek subdivision. My truck's windshield looked like someone had poured a bucket of white concrete over it. The kind of morning where you start questioning every life decision that led you to buy a house in the northern part of the state. But honestly, none of that bothered me as much as what was inside that yellow envelope. I stood right there at the mailbox in my heavy coat and work boots, breath fogging in the air, and I read the notice twice just to make sure I hadn't misunderstood it. Then I read it a third time. The HOA, specifically the Maplewood Creek Homeowners Association, had fined me $250 for operating a snow plow on my private easement before 7:00 a.m. That was the offense. That was the big crime I had committed against the peaceful community of Maplewood Creek. Plowing my own driveway easement at 6 in the morning during a snowstorm. I want you to understand something about that easement before we go any further. It runs along the back edge of my property and cuts diagonally through a corner of the development. When I bought the house 7 years ago, my attorney flagged it immediately. The easement is mine. I own it. It appears on the deed, it appears on the county plat maps, and it was recorded long before the HOA even existed. The HOA has a separate access agreement that gives residents the right to use it as a secondary vehicle exit point. But the land itself, the maintenance responsibility, and every cost associated with keeping it passable, all of that falls squarely on me. Not the HOA, me, and I had been a good neighbor about it. Every winter for 7 years I got up before dawn, hitched my little plow blade to the front of my truck, and I cleared that easement so my neighbors could use it. I didn't charge anyone. I didn't ask for anything. I just did it because it was my property and I wanted it clear, and conveniently, everyone else benefited too. So you can imagine how I felt standing there in 12-degree, whether holding a $250 fine that told me I had violated HOA Rule 4.7, subsection C, which prohibited loud mechanical equipment operation before 7:00 a.m. within the community boundaries, and that the fine was due within 30 days. I knew exactly who had filed the complaint. Even before I flipped the notice over and saw the name of the reporting resident printed in that little box at the bottom, I already knew. Vicki Thornbury. Vicki lived in the big colonial house at the end of Birchwood Lane, maybe 300 feet from the easement. She had been on the HOA board for about 4 years and had somehow managed to get herself appointed as compliance officer, which meant she had a laminated badge, a clipboard, and entirely too much free time. Vicki was the kind of woman who measured the height of your holiday lawn decorations with an actual tape measure. She had once sent a formal written warning to the Kowalski family because their garden hose reel was, and I quote, visible from the street in a manner inconsistent with community aesthetic standards. The hose reel was beige, on the side of the house, half hidden by a shrub. So Vicki Thornbury was very much the person who would hear a plow at 6 a.m. during a blizzard and decide to file a complaint rather than, I don't know, go back to sleep. I tucked the fine into my coat pocket, went back inside, poured myself a second cup of coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table. I looked out the window at the snow-covered backyard for a long moment. Then I called my attorney, a guy named Dennis, who I'd used for the original property purchase and a few other things over the years. Dennis picked up on the third ring, which for a man who charges $300 an hour is honestly impressive at 8 in the morning. I explained the situation. Dennis asked me to scan and email the fine notice, which I did right from my phone. He called me back in about 20 minutes while I was in the middle of shoveling my front walk. Paul, he said, and I could hear him already enjoying this, they can't fine you for this. I know they can't, I said. The easement is private property. Their noise ordinance applies to community property and community amenities. They have no jurisdiction over your easement, regardless of what their access agreement says. The access agreement gives residents passage rights. It gives the HOA nothing. I know, I said again. So you want to fight the fine? Dennis, I said, scraping a shovelful of snow off my front step, I want to do a lot more than fight the fine. I want to back up a few weeks because this didn't start with the fine. It started with Vicki Thornbury and a board meeting in early December, about 3 weeks before the big snowstorm that triggered all of this. Maplewood Creek HOA holds monthly meetings in the community clubhouse, which is a squat little building next to the pool that in winter basically serves as a cold storage unit since nobody uses it. I had started attending the meetings about 2 years prior, after the board tried to pass a rule that would have let them access residents' backyards for inspection purposes, with only 24 hours notice. I had killed that proposal by showing up with a printed copy of state property law and reading the relevant sections aloud into the minutes. Since then, Vicki had regarded me with the kind of tightly managed politeness that suggested she would very much like me to move to another state. At the December meeting, Vicki had raised the issue of the easement for the first time in a formal setting. She had a whole printed presentation. She argued that since the easement was used primarily by community residents as a secondary exit, it should be brought under HOA maintenance management. What that actually meant, as she laid it out in that sweet, reasonable-sounding voice she uses when she's trying to sneak something past people, was that the HOA would take over maintenance responsibilities, which would allow them to bill it as a community expense, which would raise everyone's dues, and which would give Vicki personal oversight of who got easement access and when. I raised my hand. Vicki ignored me for about 4 minutes, which is her move. Then she had to call on me because I kept my hand up the entire time like a stubborn kindergartner. I said, calmly and politely, that the easement was private property, that I had maintained it voluntarily for 7 years, that I had no intention of surrendering maintenance authority, and that any attempt by the HOA to assert management control over private property would be legally actionable. I used those exact words. Legally actionable. You could hear the shift in the room. A few people looked at each other. Vicki's smile went completely stiff. She tabled the proposal, but she never dropped it. I could tell by the way she looked at me when the meeting ended, like she was running calculations behind her eyes. So when the snowstorm hit in late December and I was out there at 6 a.m. clearing my easement like I had done every single winter, I knew she was watching. I just didn't think she'd actually be stupid enough to fine me for it. She was. Now, back to the morning after I got the fine. Dennis and I had laid out a general plan on the phone, but before I did anything formal, I decided to go knock on some doors. I started with my direct neighbors, the Pattersons, who lived to my left, then the Garcias across the street. Then I walked over to the Hendersons, the Nuyens, the Rileys, and the Acaffer family on the back street. These were all people who used my easement regularly. Some of them used it every single day to avoid the main entrance, which always backed up during school drop-off hours. Every single one of them was annoyed about the fine. Not surprised, but annoyed. Linda Garcia told me she'd gotten a warning from Vicki the previous October because her mailbox post was exhibiting rust that could be considered a community blight, which was a phrase Vicki had apparently made up on the spot since it appears nowhere in the actual HOA documents. Bob Acaffer told me Vicki had tried to have his fence modified because the boards were running horizontally instead of vertically, which also had no basis in any actual rule. Carl Riley told me Vicki had complained about his truck being too big to park in his own driveway, which is not a thing. I knew all of these stories individually, but sitting there in people's warm kitchens over the next couple of days while snow piled up outside, hearing them all together in sequence, I started to understand that Vicki had been running a quiet campaign of harassment for years, selectively targeting people she didn't like or people she perceived as challenges to her authority. And everybody had just been absorbing it. That was going to change. I sent a formal written response to the HOA rejecting the fine. Dennis drafted it, and it was a beautiful piece of work. It laid out the legal status of the easement, cited the county plat documentation, quoted the exact language of the access agreement, and cited 3 relevant state statutes. It concluded by noting that if the HOA attempted to collect the fine by any means, including by applying it to my dues account or by any other financial mechanism, we would consider that an unauthorized attempt to convert private property rights into a financial liability, and we would seek injunctive relief and recover attorney fees. Dennis had a way of making legal language sound like a thundercloud rolling in over a field. I hand-delivered it to the HOA's management company office, got a signed receipt, and sent a copy certified mail to the board's registered address. Then I went home, got online, and spent about an hour looking up gate installation services. This is where things got interesting. The access agreement, the one that gave residents the right to use my easement as a secondary exit, contained a clause I had always known was there, but had never needed to use. It said the easement access was provided at the discretion of the property owner and could be modified or restricted with reasonable notice to the association. The agreement had been drafted before the HOA really understood what they were signing, because it had been negotiated by the original developer, who was a sharp guy and had protected my predecessor's interests thoroughly. There was no guarantee of permanent, unrestricted access. There was no clause that prevented me from installing a gate. There was no requirement that I keep the easement open at all times. I called 3 gate companies that week, got quotes, picked one that could do a solid 12-foot aluminum double swing gate with a keypad and an intercom unit. The quote was reasonable, the company was available, and they said they could install within 2 weeks pending ground conditions. Given that the ground was frozen solid, they'd need to use a powered auger and some concrete that could cure in low temperatures, but they'd done it before in winter. I said, let's do it. Meanwhile, I went back to the HOA board. I sent a second letter, this one not through Dennis but written by me personally, which is sometimes more effective because it's direct and human and doesn't read like a legal filing. I wrote that I was giving them formal notice under the access agreement that I intended to restrict easement access. I noted that I would be installing a gate within the next 2 to 3 weeks. I noted that going forward, the gate would be kept locked by default, and that access codes would be issued at my discretion. I was not required to give them access codes at all, though I planned to be reasonable about it, unless the HOA continued to pursue the fine, in which case reasonableness was going to become significantly harder. I dropped that letter off at the same management company office and got another signed receipt. I will tell you what I did not anticipate, which was Vicki Thornbury showing up at my front door 3 hours later. I saw her coming up the walk through the window. She was wearing a big puffy coat in a sort of unfortunate mustard color, and she had her clipboard, which is her version of a security blanket. I let her knock, counted to 5, then opened the door. She opened with, "Paul, I think we need to have a conversation about your letter." I said, "Come in," because it was 18 degrees outside, and even Vicki Thornbury doesn't deserve to stand in 18-degree weather. She sat across from me at the kitchen table. I noticed she had put the clipboard on the table with the top sheet facing her, so I couldn't see what was on it, which I found amusing. I poured her a cup of coffee because my mother raised me right. She told me she thought the gate idea was an overreaction. She said the fine had been issued in good faith. She said the board simply hadn't realized the noise ordinance might not apply to the easement. She said if I wanted to dispute the fine through proper channels, that was my right, and she was sure the board would review it. She said all of this in that warm, reasonable-sounding voice. I let her finish. Then I said, very calmly, that the fine had not been issued in good faith. That she had known for 3 weeks, since the December board meeting, that the easement was private property outside HOA jurisdiction. That she had filed the noise complaint anyway. That filing a bad faith complaint to generate a fine against a homeowner over private property you know you don't have jurisdiction over is not a good faith action, and that depending on how one wanted to look at it, it edged toward abuse of authority. Her expression did a complicated thing. The warmth in it went somewhere else, and something harder took its place for just a second before she pulled the mask back on. She said the board would be willing to waive the fine as a courtesy. I said I wasn't asking for a courtesy. I was asking them to formally rescind it and acknowledge in writing that the easement was outside HOA jurisdiction. Those are different things. She said the board would need to meet to discuss any formal acknowledgement. I said that was fine, they could discuss it. The gate installation was scheduled regardless. If they wanted to discuss access codes, they could reach out through formal channels. Vicki picked up her clipboard, thanked me for the coffee, and left. I watched her walk back up the street through the kitchen window. Her posture was stiff and her steps were sharp in the snow. The gate company came out the following Thursday. It was cold as anything, maybe 8 degrees in the morning, and the crew showed up in a big truck with a propane-powered auger for the frozen ground. They drilled the post holes, poured quick-setting cold-weather concrete, and had the posts up by noon. The gate panels went up the afternoon of the second day. By Friday evening, I had a 12-foot aluminum double-swing gate across the entrance of my easement, a keypad on the outside pillar, and an intercom unit that connected to my phone. I set the code to something I would remember, did not share it with the HOA. Then I put up a sign. It was a simple metal sign, the kind you can get made at any sign shop, mounted on the gate. It said, "Private easement access restricted property of Paul Dawson, contact 555-147 for access information." That night, right around 5 p.m. when people were coming home from work, the gate stopped the whole secondary exit queue cold. I'm not going to pretend I didn't watch from my living room window. There were about 9 cars backed up within the first 15 minutes. People were getting out and reading the sign. I could see them on their phones. My phone started ringing at 5:08 p.m. Not from people I knew, but from residents I had never spoken to who had apparently gotten my number from the sign. I let those go to voicemail. I had a message set up that explained the situation briefly. The easement was private property. It had been subjected to an invalid HOA fine. The gate had been installed while that matter was being resolved, and anyone seeking to discuss access should attend the next HOA board meeting or contact the board to request a resolution. By 5:30, I had 14 voicemails and about 6 texts from numbers I didn't recognize. Also 3 calls from people I did know. Linda Garcia, who was laughing so hard she could barely form sentences, Bob Acaffer, who said simply "good, keep it locked," and Carl Riley, who asked if there was anything he could do to help and offered to bring beer. I told Carl the beer could wait, but to spread the word about what was actually happening, because I wanted people to understand this wasn't random spite. It was a response to the fine. Carl Riley, as it turned out, was an extremely efficient word spreader. By the next morning, I had gotten messages from what felt like half the community. The story was circulating through the neighborhood's group text threads, which I'm not part of but which apparently several people were forwarding to me. The framing was pretty much accurate. HOA fined a homeowner for plowing his own private easement before 7 a.m. Homeowner installed a gate in response. Easement now locked. Vicki sent an HOA official notice to all residents that same morning. I got a copy because it went to every mailbox in the community. It was carefully worded to make the situation sound like I had taken an aggressive and unauthorized action to restrict community access, without mentioning the fine at all. It said the board was working diligently to restore easement access as quickly as possible, and invited residents to contact the board with concerns. I took a photo of that notice, wrote a brief factual account of what had actually happened in plain language, the fine, the legal basis for rejecting it, the access agreement clause, the gate installation, and I slipped it into every mailbox in the community. All 47 of them. It took me about an hour in the cold, but the exercise kept me warm. I included a copy of the access agreement clause and a copy of the county plat showing the easement ownership. I kept it factual. I didn't editorialize. I didn't call anyone names or make accusations. I just presented the documents and let people read them. That was a Friday. The emergency HOA board meeting was called for the following Monday. In the 2 days between Friday and Monday, the main entrance to Maplewood Creek was backed up every single morning and every single evening. The secondary exit through my easement was the only other way out of the neighborhood besides the main gate, and with it locked, everyone was funneling through one point. The morning school drop-off situation alone was apparently a minor disaster. People were sitting in their cars for 20 minutes trying to get out. In January, in the snow and cold. I heard from Linda Garcia that a woman named Pamela Hobart had called the HOA office 3 times in one day about the traffic situation. Pamela was not someone who called the HOA about things lightly. She was quiet and kept to herself, but apparently she had sat in her car for 25 minutes trying to get her kid to school on time and had decided that was the moment she became politically engaged. Pamela started a petition. She got 31 of the 47 households to sign it within 48 hours. The petition called for the HOA board to formally rescind the fine against me, issue a written acknowledgement of the easement's private status, and implement a formal policy preventing board members from filing complaints against homeowners in areas outside HOA jurisdiction. I didn't ask Pamela to do this. I didn't even know her particularly well. She just did it because she was 32 minutes late to work on the worst traffic day, and she had read my flyer. The Monday board meeting was the fullest the community clubhouse had ever been. There were people standing along the back wall. I counted close to 60 people in a room that had maybe 30 folding chairs. It was cold outside, maybe 15 degrees, and people had come straight from work or dinner or wherever they'd been, still in their winter coats, and the room smelled like wet wool and coffee from the urn someone had set up on the side table. Vicki sat at the board table at the front of the room with the other 2 board members, a retired guy named Frank Bellows who mostly went along with whatever Vicki said, and a younger woman named Cass Drummond who had been on the board for about a year, and who I had always gotten the impression was not entirely comfortable with Vicki's management style. Vicki opened the meeting by asking for order. She got it, mostly because people were there to listen and then to speak, not to shout. She presented the board's position. The fine had been issued under the noise ordinance in good faith, and the board believed it had been applied correctly. The gate was an extreme response. The board was willing to discuss the matter. Then she opened the floor to residents. Pamela Hobart went first. She was a small, composed woman in a green coat, and she laid out the situation with the precision of someone who had spent the weekend thinking about nothing else. She had read the access agreement. She had looked up the county plat. She had also done something that nobody else had done yet, which was to pull up the HOA's own governing documents on the state's online filing system and verify that the noise ordinance specifically applied only to association-maintained common areas and amenities, which was language that clearly excluded private property. She brought printed copies and passed them around. You could see Frank Bellows reading his copy and looking uncomfortable. Then Bob Acaffer stood up. Bob is a big, quiet guy, and when he talks, people pay attention because he doesn't do it often. He said he had lived in Maplewood Creek for 11 years and Paul Dawson had plowed that easement every single winter morning without ever asking for a dime or a thank you, and the idea that the HOA had fined him for doing it was an embarrassment. He said the board owed a formal apology and a formal correction, not a discussion. Carl Riley said he had spoken to an attorney friend of his who had confirmed that filing a complaint against a homeowner under a rule that doesn't apply is a potential abuse of authority under state HOA governance statutes and could expose the board to personal liability. He may or may not have embellished the severity of the liability situation, but the room didn't know that. Cass Drummond, the younger board member, leaned forward and quietly said, "Vicki, I think we should just rescind the fine." Vicki said the board needed to carefully consider any formal policy acknowledgments. I raised my hand. Vicki looked at me. I think she was hoping I would somehow not be there. I stood up and I said this as calmly and clearly as I could. I said I had no interest in making this a prolonged fight. I said the easement had been maintained by me for 7 years at my expense for the community's benefit. I said the fine was invalid, and everyone in the room who had read the documents knew it. I said the gate was going to remain locked until 3 things happened. The fine was formally rescinded. The board issued a written acknowledgement that the easement was private property outside HOA jurisdiction, and the board implemented a formal review process requiring that before any fine is issued, the board must verify that the applicable rule covers the subject property. I also said that the gate was legally my right to operate. The access agreement gave residents permission to pass, not an unconditional right. I said I intended to issue access codes to residents directly, bypassing the HOA entirely as soon as those 3 conditions were met. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Frank Bellows said, "I move that we rescind the fine." Cass Drummond seconded it immediately. Vicki's expression was extraordinarily controlled. She said we should table this pending a legal review. Frank said, "I think we've done enough tabling. The residents are here and they deserve an answer tonight." The vote was 2-1. Fine rescinded. Vicki voted no. The formal written acknowledgement took another 2 weeks of back and forth through Dennis, but I had the 2 board votes I needed, and Vicki was outvoted at every step. Dennis was happy. He had a clear, well-documented win and a client who kept excellent records. The final acknowledgement letter was signed by all 3 board members, including a notably cramped signature from Vicki that looked like she had written it while trying very hard not to break the pen. 2 days after I received the signed letter, I issued access codes to every resident directly. I sent a simple postcard to each household with the gate code and a note that said the easement was back open. I asked only that people not share the code outside the community, and that they reach out to me directly if they had any issues. Not through the HOA. Directly. The response was warm in a way that felt a little out of proportion to what I had done, but I think people were relieved in a way that went beyond the traffic issue. There's something exhausting about living under someone like Vicki, where you never quite know when the next yellow envelope is coming. Having that resolved, even partially, even in one corner of the community, felt like an opening of pressure. But here's the thing. Here is where the story actually gets complicated and where the winter really starts to matter. About 3 weeks after the gate went up and came back down, so we're into the 2nd week of January now, we got another storm. This one was worse than the December storm. The forecast said 6 to 9 inches. We got 14. The temperature dropped to -4 at night. The main road into Maplewood Creek was iced over, and the community's contracted plow service was running 6 hours behind. People were essentially stranded. I was out at 5:30 a.m. with my plow. This time I was not going to be stopped by anything. I cleared the easement first then because I had a plow and most of my neighbors didn't. I did about half the street in front of the nearest houses while I was at it. I wasn't required to. I just did it. At 6:15 a.m., I got a notification on my phone from my doorbell camera. Someone was at my front door. I checked the feed. It was Vicki Thornbury, standing on my front step in a massive coat with a fur-trimmed hood, holding her clipboard. I want to be clear. This woman was at my door at 6:15 in the morning in -4-degree weather. I pulled on my coat and boots and answered the door. She told me she was filing a second noise complaint. She said the plowing was occurring before 7 a.m. again. She said she had every intention of issuing another fine. I looked at her for a second. Then I looked past her at the street, which was completely white and still, the snow heavy and undisturbed except for the tracks my truck had cut through it. I said, "Vicki, the board formally acknowledged in writing that the easement is outside HOA jurisdiction. They also established a pre-issuance review process. You cannot file a noise complaint against my easement." She said the review process didn't prevent her from filing the complaint. It just required review before the fine was issued. She said she was the compliance officer, and it was her duty to report violations. I said, "Vicki, if you issue a fine that you know is invalid under terms that the board has already formally accepted, that moves from administrative error into something more deliberate." She said she was acting in her official capacity. I said, "I have a camera on the easement. I have cameras on my property. I've had them for years. I have footage of everything." She didn't say anything for a second. I said, "I also have the chain of events documented going back to the December board meeting. The email I sent Dennis the morning I got the first fine, his response, the certified mail receipts, the board meeting minutes where you tabled the easement management proposal. All of it is timestamped and preserved." She said she was still filing the complaint. I said, "That's your right. I'll make sure my attorney is available." She left. I went back to plowing. She did file the complaint. The fine notice arrived 4 days later. $250, same as before, same citation of Rule 4.7 subsection C. Dennis sent a response within 24 hours, but this time he added something to the letter. He noted that this was the second time a fine had been issued against private property under a rule the board had formally acknowledged did not apply. He noted that the individual who filed the complaint had attended the board meeting where the acknowledgement was voted on and had voted on it herself. He used the phrase "bad faith" twice, and the second time he used it, he cited the relevant section of state statute on HOA governance and homeowner protections, which in our state includes provisions about board members who abuse their positions to harass homeowners. He said we were putting the board on formal notice that if the fine was not rescinded within 10 business days, we would be filing a complaint with the state's HOA Oversight Office and initiating a civil action against the board and specifically against Vicki Thornbury in her individual capacity as the filing officer. Personal liability. That was the magic phrase. Board members can sometimes be shielded from liability when they act in good faith on behalf of the association. When you have documented evidence that they're acting in bad faith, specifically when they have been formally told an action is outside their authority and they do it again anyway, that shield gets a lot thinner. The fine was rescinded in 6 days, but more than that happened. Cass Drummond called me. She called me from her personal cell phone, not through the HOA, and she told me that she and Frank Bellows had had a long conversation, and they believed Vicki's pattern of filing complaints and issuing fines in areas she knew were outside her authority might constitute a violation of state HOA statute that they were now personally exposed to if they didn't act. She asked if I would be willing to compile my documented evidence into a summary that they could present to the board's management company and potentially to their HOA insurance carrier. I said yes. I spent a weekend going through my files, my emails, my camera footage, my certified mail receipts, and the board meeting minutes I had been keeping copies of for 2 years. I also reached out to Linda Garcia, Bob Acaffer, Carl Riley, Pamela Hobart, and 3 other neighbors who had been targeted by Vicki's complaints. I asked them to write up their own experiences with dates, and most of them did. What I assembled was not a rage-fueled accusation package. It was a timeline. A quiet, organized, time-stamped timeline of complaints, fines, and warnings that had been issued without valid basis, many of them after the subjects had objected or pushed back. some of them seemingly targeting people who had spoken up at board meetings or signed petitions or otherwise made themselves visible as people Vicki didn't like. The pattern was ugly when you laid it all out in sequence. There were 12 instances over 4 years where residents had received complaints or fines for things that either didn't violate any actual HOA rule or that fell outside HOA jurisdiction entirely. In 9 of those 12 cases, the targeted resident had either spoken at a board, meeting in opposition to something Vicki was pushing, signed a petition, or somehow else come to Vicki's attention as an unfriendly presence. When Cass Drummond took that package to the board's management company, the management company's own legal team apparently had some strong opinions about it. They contacted Vicki directly and informed her that they were recommending she step down from the compliance officer role immediately and that the board consider her removal from the board entirely while the pattern of complaints was reviewed. Vicki did not take that quietly. According to Cass, she showed up at the management company's office and caused what was described to me as a scene, which is a polite word for what apparently happened. She accused the management company of siding with problem residents against the board. She accused Frank and Cass of betraying her. She said she had been the only one doing her job properly. During this meeting, she apparently also said something that she should not have said. According to Cass, who was present, Vicki stated explicitly that she had filed the second noise complaint against me specifically to send a message about what happened at the board meeting in January. Those were her words, send a message. In front of the management company's attorney. That is not a good faith administrative action. That is targeted retaliation against a homeowner for exercising their legal rights. And in our state, that is covered under the HOA statute in a way that has actual teeth. The management company's attorney sent a letter to me the following week, which Dennis received and forwarded. It was careful and formal, but the substance of it was that Vicki had made statements during the meeting that acknowledged the retaliatory nature of the second fine, and that the board and management company were taking steps to address the situation internally and wanted to know if I intended to pursue individual claims. Dennis and I talked it over. I didn't want to spend the next 2 years in court. I also didn't want Vicki to just shuffle off and do this to someone else in another community. What I wanted was accountability that was proportionate and real. We sent back a response that laid out our terms for not pursuing a civil claim. Vicki would resign from the HOA board entirely, not just from the compliance officer role. The board would implement a formal appeals process for all fines that allowed homeowners to challenge fines, without attending a public meeting if they preferred a written process. The board would conduct a review of all outstanding fines and warnings issued in the last 4 years under Vicki's direction, and any that lacked valid basis would be rescinded and refunds issued where applicable. And the board would send a written apology to the residents who had been improperly cited. It took about 3 weeks of back and forth. Dennis earned his fee, but in the end, every one of those terms was accepted. Vicki Thornbury resigned from the Maplewood Creek HOA board on the 14th of February, which I will acknowledge is a darkly appropriate date for a story about someone whose instinct for affection expressed itself through fines. The review of old fines resulted in 8 rescissions and 5 refunds. Linda Garcia got $80 back. The Kowalski family of the beige hose reel incident got $60 back. Bob Ockafer got $120 back because it turned out Vicki had fined him twice over the fence board orientation thing, which had no basis in any document anywhere. The written apology letters went out in late February. They were brief and businesslike, signed by Cass Drummond as interim board chair, and they didn't mention Vicki by name, but they acknowledged that certain complaints and fines had been issued without adequate basis and expressed the board's regret for any inconvenience caused. People received them with varying degrees of satisfaction. Some felt it was too little. Some were genuinely touched. Bob Ockaffer texted me a photo of his letter and a thumbs up. For me, the most satisfying moment of the whole thing was quieter than any of that. It was a Sunday in late February, maybe 3 weeks after Vicki resigned. We'd gotten a fresh inch of overnight snow, just a light dusting, the kind that makes everything look clean and untouched in the early morning. I was up at 5:30. I hitched the plow blade to my truck, backed out of the garage, drove to the easement and cleared it. The whole thing took maybe 12 minutes. Nobody complained. There was no yellow envelope in my future. There was just the sound of the plow motor and the whisper of snow moving aside and the pale blue of the early morning sky above the tree line. I drove back to my garage, detached the plow, went inside and made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window with my mug and watched the neighborhood wake up. A car pulled out of the Garcia's driveway and went straight for the easement, the secondary exit, easy and smooth. Another car followed a few minutes later. The gate was open, the code was shared, and nobody needed to sit in backed-up traffic at the main entrance. It was just a neighborhood, functioning the way a neighborhood is supposed to function. Now, I want to close out the threads on a few things because people always want to know what happened next. The gate stayed up. Even after everything was resolved, I kept the gate installed. I kept the code active and shared with residents. But I kept the hardware there because, frankly, it was a good gate, and it kept random cut-through traffic from using the easement as a shortcut, which had been a low-level irritant for years. Residents appreciated having a controlled access point. I appreciated that the gate existed on my property as a documented assertion of ownership. Nobody forgot it was private property anymore, which was the whole point. Cass Drummond ran an informal interest meeting in March to talk about the HOA structure going forward. About 20 residents showed up. The main things people wanted were transparency in how complaints were handled, clearer communication from the board, and a less adversarial relationship between the board and the community it was supposed to be serving. None of that was revolutionary. It was just basic decency translated into organizational structure. Cass turned out to be a pretty effective board chair once she wasn't working in Vicki's shadow. Frank Bellows started actually contributing at meetings, instead of just nodding along with whatever Vicki said. They eventually added a fourth board member, a guy named Theo Andrada from the south end of the community who had an accountant's eye for budgets and an accountant's personality, meaning he was extremely boring in the most useful possible way. He went through the HOA's financials and found that several line items in the budget were vague in ways that had allowed discretionary spending without real accountability. He tightened everything up. Dues stayed the same. The propane situation was a separate but related story. During that bad January storm, 2 houses in the community ran low on propane because the delivery trucks couldn't get through the iced-up main entrance, and the secondary easement was gated. One of those houses belonged to an older couple, the Marshes, who were in their late 70s and whose heating system ran entirely on propane. Their tank hit reserve levels during the 3 days when neither exit was reliably passable. Their son, who lives about 40 minutes away, had called me directly after reading my flyer, asking if he could use the gate code to get a propane delivery truck through the easement. I said yes immediately and gave him the code on the spot. The delivery truck came through that afternoon. The Marshes stayed warm. I found out about this later through Carl Riley, who had heard it from the son. I hadn't even known it had happened at the time because it was during the period when my phone was full of messages and I was managing a lot of things at once. When I heard about it, I felt a complicated mix of things, glad that it had worked out, and also aware that the gate itself could have created a real problem if the son hadn't reached out directly. After everything was settled, I added a permanent exception to the gate management. Any resident could call or text me for emergency access at any hour, and the code would be provided immediately. I also added a posted note on the gate that said, "Emergency access available 24/7, call the number above." The number rang to my cell. A few people tested it over the following months to make sure it worked. It always worked. The thing about living in a community is that you're always balancing your own rights against the practical needs of the people around you. I knew that going in. I never wanted to be the guy who locked the gate and left people stranded. What I wanted was to be the guy who had the right to lock the gate and chose, most of the time, not to. That distinction matters. It's the difference between having power and being accountable with it, versus having power and using it however you feel like in the moment. The latter description is what Vicki Thornbury had been doing for 4 years, and the distinction, when presented clearly to a community of neighbors, turned out to be pretty easy to understand. I got a card in the mail in early March. It was from the Marshes, the older couple whose propane had run low. It was a handwritten card on heavy cream-colored paper, and it said thank you for the access and thank you for fighting for the neighborhood, and they hoped I would be around for a long time. It was signed by both of them. I put it on the fridge. Sometimes people ask me if I had known what was coming when I got that first yellow envelope, would I have handled it differently? And honestly, no. I might have gotten to the gate faster, but the overall approach, document everything, stay factual, build community support, let the legal reality do the heavy lifting. All of that I would do exactly the same. You don't need to be aggressive when the facts are entirely on your side. You just need to be organized and patient and willing to follow through. The gate cost me about $2,000 to install. Dennis's fees over the whole process came to roughly $4,000. I recovered nothing financially. I didn't sue for attorney fees, though I could have. I made a deliberate choice to resolve it through terms rather than litigation because litigation is slow and expensive and bad for communities, and because the terms I got were genuinely better than a court judgment would have been. What I got instead was a neighborhood that functions better, an HOA that behaves like a service to residents rather than a bureaucratic apparatus for one person's ego, and a gate on my private easement that I can open or close as I choose, that serves the community because I want it to, not because Vicki Thornbury decided it was a community asset without asking me. When March came and the snow started to melt, and you could see the actual driveway surface again for the first time since December, there was this particular afternoon that I remember clearly. It was a Saturday, temperature up in the mid-30s, which after a January that had dipped to -4 felt almost warm. I was out doing some cleanup around the easement gate area, picking up a few stray pieces of debris that had been buried in the snow all winter. My neighbor Carlos Garcia came by with his 2 kids, who were about 8 and 10 and had been building some kind of snow fortress in the yard across the street all morning. Carlos stopped and leaned on the gate frame while his kids chased each other around the melting snow piles nearby. He said, "You know what's wild? I've lived here 8 years and I never actually thought about whose land this was." I said, "Most people don't, it just looked like a road." He laughed. "It kind of is a road." "Yeah," I said. "A road I own." He nodded and looked up the length of the easement, the way it curved slightly before it opened up to the main street beyond. "You know what I keep thinking? The whole thing could have been solved in about 10 minutes if she just called you first." "Yep," I said, "but then we wouldn't have had all this excitement." "True." His older kid came running back yelling something about whose turn it was to be the snow fortress king, and Carlos got pulled back into referee duty, and I went back to picking up debris. And that was more or less the end of it in the way that neighborhood stories end. Not dramatically, but gradually, as things settle back into the rhythms of ordinary life, just with a few things permanently changed for the better. The snow kept melting. The easement stayed open. The gate stayed functional. And every morning that winter had one more still, dark, before dawn hour when I climbed into my truck, hitched the plow, and cleared the road without anyone sending me a yellow envelope about it. That's the whole story. It started with a fine that shouldn't have existed, and it ended with a neighborhood that runs a little more fairly and a gate on my property that everyone now understands is there because I put it there and I choose, every day, to make it available to the people I live next to. Vicki Thornbury moved out of Maplewood Creek about 6 months after she resigned from the board. I don't know where she went. I genuinely hope she found somewhere that makes her happy. But I also genuinely hope the HOA, wherever she ended up, has better documentation practices than we did when she started. Because someone, eventually, is going to get an early morning plow complaint from her new neighborhood. And I hope that homeowner has a good attorney and a gate company on speed dial.